Okay. Hi. I'm Linda Deir, and I read to you guys from my books. Specifically, today is guided on Saturdays at 1 p.m. Pacific time, right here on my Facebook page, Facebook timeline, and YouTube channel. So enjoy. 2 Saturdays ago, I read to you from chapter 14 of my true life story, Guided. Her spirit guide angels were her best friends and life coaches. I read about everyone's reaction to change, dreading the personal relationship arena. In a moment of clarity, I realized that I had been busying my life back up with this subdivision, buying the new townhouse, and being in the planning stages of designing the Lake Tahoe house that I hoped to start building soon. Working all the time had been protecting me from looking at personal relationships. Being friends with Mary was about all I could stand. My guides had made it clear that I needed to tend to my personal life skills. I could feel I was losing my way again, but I just couldn't stop it. That was how much I dreaded the thought of venturing into the personal relationship arena. Today, I will read to you from chapter 15 of Guided, the shock that changed everything. All the way up to the Tahoe house, I was crunching numbers in my mind. Like a switch had gone off. I had now become obsessed with what I was going to do once the Tahoe house was done. I had to stop along the way to keep some business appointments, which put me behind about 30 minutes behind Mark and Cindy. Once I got back on the road, everything was fine for a while. Then, about 10 minutes before my turnoff, I was overcome with a terrible feeling. In an instant, I knew Mark and Cindy had been in a car accident. It was crystal clear. I shifted out of planning mode and into survival mode as both of my arms went limp, and it took everything I had physically, emotionally, and mentally to keep driving. So sit back and relax as I tell the story of how, despite the dysfunction, my spirit guides took me on one journey after another that led me to a greater understanding of myself. Guided. Guided is available on Amazon in paperback, Kindle, and audiobook, and I read the audiobook myself. Chapter 15, The Shock That Changed Everything. All the way up to Tahoe, I was crunching numbers in my mind like a switch had gone off. I had now become obsessed with what I was going to do once the Tahoe house was done. I had to stop along the way to keep some business appointments, which put me about 30 minutes behind Mark and Cindy. Once I got back on the road, everything was fine for a while. Then, about 10 minutes before my turnoff, I was overcome with a terrible feeling. In an instant, I knew Mark and Cindy had been in a car accident. It was crystal clear. I shifted out of planning mode and into survival as both of my arms went limp, and it took everything I had, physically, emotionally, and mentally, to keep driving. I was in a panic and told myself it couldn't be true. The panic became overwhelming. As I continued to drive, I was getting guidance that was telling me that when I got there, to slowly turn off the car, pull on the brake, open the door, and then get out. These were literally step by step instructions telling me what to do once I got there. At this point, I was so overwhelmed with the information I had already received from guidance that thinking about What there was pushed me over the edge. But it was something I already knew. I continued driving and turned off onto Highway 89. In desperation, I started talking to myself out loud, telling myself that this wasn't happening. Then, all of a sudden, a message came through. Saying Mark was dead and Cindy was alive. Cindy would live. I was grateful and sick inside at the same time. I already knew what had happened, what to do when I got there, and the outcome. I had not yet put together the fact that I had seen this coming for at least 10 days. No more than 5 minutes after the last messages came through, I heard sirens in the distance in front of me. I began crying uncontrollably. There was very little traffic, and I drove up on the accident scene. The wrecked truck was on the side of the highway. Another car had been hit that was nearby, and the emergency vehicles were already there. Everything was happening in slow motion as I turned off the engine, pulled on the brake, and got out of the car. I actually fell out of the car as my legs collapsed underneath me. This is the hardest chapter for me to read. The people who were standing around the accident saw me fall out of the car and figured out I was connected to the people in the accident. They came over and grabbed me, asked me who I was. I told them, and they directed me to Cindy, who was lying on the ground face up. She was still unconscious. I saw the blood on her face, and it took my breath away. Then I gently put my hand on her head, and she woke up. I told her I was there to keep her eyes closed and just relax. She was in shock, so she couldn't feel any pain, and she wasn't panicking. I didn't know the extent of her injuries. I was doing everything I could to speak in a composed voice so she wouldn't freak out. The paramedics were getting her prepared to put her into the ambulance as I stood up. And quietly had a moment of emotional release. Then I walked over to the truck. I was about 15 feet from the truck when I hit a force field. It was an invisible barrier I could not pass through. I tried to go around it somehow, but couldn't. The paramedics were right there with Mark, but I was denied access by this invisible barrier. I went back to Cindy. I knew Mark was not going to make it because they made that clear to me before I even got there. Then I sensed Mark's presence, and he did not want presence, and he knew he did not want me to dwell on his passing or see him like that. It was clear that my focus was to be entirely on Cindy. I could feel Mark's deep concern for Cindy and me. He made it very clear how sorry he was about what happened, and he was doing everything in his power to see me through this, step by step. His regret about what happened was palatable. His presence with me from the moment the accident happened, as it was him who first notified me the instant he was released from his body. It was he who told me what the outcome would be and what to do when I got there. He continued to be with us as a guide who was walking me through the entire ordeal. Although I knew I had been forewarned and assisted by my guides, and then by Mark, the instant he left his body, there was a part of me that had trouble accepting what happened and how final it was. The shock that would change everything was now underway. Leaving the accident scene in the ambulance with Cindy, I was having trouble breathing, but I was holding it together so Cindy wouldn't panic. She was still in shock, and I couldn't tell how badly she was hurt under all the blood on her face. She began asking me how Mark was, but I could only tell her I wasn't sure. Ugh. We got to the hospital, and they took her to the emergency room to evaluate her condition. I was in the waiting room when the next ambulance showed up with the people in the other car that Mark had collided with. They had broken bones and lacerations, but no one had life-threatening injuries. Then the ambulance showed up. It carried Mark. The paramedics took him through another door. To keep myself steady, I kept my thoughts on Cindy. The staff was running every which way and had no time to talk to me. Then one of the staff came out to tell me that Mark was on life support and was going to make it. I cried out loud in relief and fell to the floor. My relief was short-lived. Almost immediately, another person came out looking grave. They told me they had been mistaken. Mark was on life support as they evaluated his injuries, but it didn't look good. I knew he would either die or was already gone. In fact, he was gone from the moment the accident happened. I know this because everything he did for us from the other side, right from the beginning of this ordeal. The hospital was just forcing his body to breathe, but he wasn't there. I tried to see Cindy, but they did not allow me to do so. Then came another message from Mark, telling me that I needed, telling me from Mark, and told me that I would not be the one who would tell his mother about what had happened, that would be the doctor's job. But I was to call Michael, who was the husband of Mark's cousin, Karen, because Mark trusted him to be the most level-headed person in the family. So that's what I did. I was guided by Mark to tell Michael not to just call Mary, but to go to her and tell her in person. I got very specific instructions from Mark that he was to tell Mary that Mark had been in an accident and that she needed to call the hospital and talk directly to the doctor. Once I handled that exactly as I was guided, the nurse came to the waiting room and took me to see Cindy. Awareness. This is how your spirit guides work. They are systematic as they make the best decisions in a timely sequence. They are always there when you need them. Always. Most of all, remember that it's not you, it's them. No one in a stressful situation like I was in can make so many precise decisions so quickly. That's divine intervention at work. You have help, your guides. Everything happens the way it's supposed to, no matter what you want or how you think it should be. Cindy had a broken nose, but did not appear to have any other injuries to her head or the rest of her body. The doctors said they would fix her broken nose, but there were no plastic surgeons at the hospital. I told him to do what was necessary to stabilize her, and I would get her to a plastic surgeon in Sacramento. Once Cindy came out of shock, she was a terrible patient. She was ill-tempered, rude, and screamed at everyone. They couldn't handle her or get her to cooperate. The accident had occurred in the morning, but it was nighttime before they released her to be sure she had no other injuries. Cindy kept asking about Mark because she did not remember anything before or during the accident. I held off as long as I could, but when they were ready to release her, I had to tell her that he had died. This actually stopped her from focusing on her own pain and suffering for the first time since the accident. It was a tragic day for both of us as we quietly mourned Mark's passing together. By that time, Karen, whose husband I had called to notify Mark's family, showed up. Apparently, they realized I would be in no condition to drive us home, so she was there to bring us back. As soon as we got in the car, she started talking badly about Mark's mother. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was a gossip and at this sensitive time was feeding up a tragedy. I guess she was angry with Mary for some reason and took this opportunity to get her revenge. I told her to stop it. Apparently, she saw that I meant it, so she did. Now I understood why Mark had been so empathic when he told me not to trust her just a day earlier at dinner. Cindy and I both fell asleep on the ride home, totally exhausted. Awareness. It's amazing how life really works when you listen and let it work. You are always in good hands with the support that's always there from your guides. Once we got home, I put Cindy to bed and called Mary. I was very concerned about her and could not put off the call even though I was wiped out. She was very glad that I called. It had been a year since we had really talked. The first thing she told me is that she had gone back with her husband because she sensed that she was going to lose one of her kids. Having the family back together would be crucial when it happened. She said it was a very strong feeling. So although it was a shock, it was not a surprise. Then she told me the details of the accident that had that she had gotten from the police. She said that Mark hit a car head on as he attempted to speed past the car in front of him. He apparently thought the oncoming car would move to the right so he could squeeze through, but that didn't happen. She told me the other driver was a priest and had admitted that he could have moved to the right, but didn't. He was very remorseful that Mark had died. Mary and Cindy. Mary said Cindy was asleep when the accident happened, causing her to be launched right through the front windshield and out of the way. The accident investigators told Mary that that was the reason Cindy lived. She had been completely relaxed when it happened. They told Mary that Mark died shortly after they got him to the hospital, that he was brain dead immediately. We talked for a long time. She did most of the talking. I felt terrible. She had lost her son, and a bit guilty that my daughter Cindy lived. Although this was the way it was meant to happen, I could not imagine what that day would have been like had it been the other way around. Mary was actually dealing with this very well, not that it was easy for her. Hearing that Mary knew one of her kids was going to die and had gone to the extreme of getting the family back together again, specifically because of it, I was beginning to see that it was Mark's time to leave. Nothing could have stopped it. I got off the phone and finally went to bed. Awareness. It was no accident that Mary and I had not spent time together over the last year. A divine force was at work. A couple of days later, Mary called me to talk about the funeral arrangements for Mark. She asked me to help her decide how to deal with his remains. I was not expecting that. I sat with it and got a clear message from my guidance that Mark needed to be buried. I believe in cremation, but my guides made it clear to me that Mark's family would need to be able to visit him so each family member could work through the loss. For the funeral, Mary asked everyone to prepare something to say to Mark. So I sat down and wrote a poem that just came to me as if it were being dictated. It spoke to how he reminded me time and time again to stop closing myself down. I was really a mess throughout that ordeal. I was in shock and couldn't seem to get past what happened. Each morning I woke up and shuddered at the thought of facing another day doing things the same way. I was really tired and in a terrible emotional pain. I just couldn't accept what happened. The only thing that mattered to me anymore was Cindy. We became very close after Mark's death. That would turn out to be our last real shot at a relationship. It was an example of how a tragedy can also create an opportunity. All right. That was the hardest chapter in Guided for me to read. I knew that was going to be a tough one. Okay, next Saturday, August 15th at 1 p.m. Pacific time, I will read to you from chapter 16 of Guided. A visitor from beyond returns with a message. Just a few days after Mark died, he materialized at my place. I was in so much pain and had been incessantly asking why this had to happen. Mark sat right in front of me in complete physical form and told me, please let me go. He said he was in a great deal of pain and I was holding him back. I never questioned how he could materialize. I just asked him why this accident had to happen. I was in shock and mad at the same time. He was so physically present that I could even smell him as he sat there right in front of me. He didn't answer and just left. He materialized a second time at the same exact location 2 days later. This time, Cindy was there with me and witnessed the second visitation. Until then, remember, you have help. You are always being guided and are never alone.